Somewhere in the back of your mind, you have a story about what it looks like when a country goes broke. Maybe it's Weimar Germany, wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread. Maybe it's Zimbabwe. Maybe it's just a vague sense of total collapse, of a nation simply ceasing to function. That story is wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong, because sovereign default has happened over 200 times since 1800 to real countries, with functioning cities and parliaments and people going about their lives. And what followed wasn't usually the end of the world. What followed was something far stranger, and in some ways far more disturbing than collapse. So let's start with the word bankrupt, which is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. What do you think it means? Because it doesn't mean what you think. When a person goes bankrupt, there's a process, courts, liquidation, a clear line between before and after. When a country goes bankrupt, economists call this a sovereign default. None of those guardrails exist. There's no international bankruptcy court, no judge to bang a gavel, no orderly queue of creditors waiting for a check. What there is instead is a government that one day simply says, we can't pay. Sometimes they announce it. Argentina did, in 2001, in the middle of a financial crisis so severe that the country cycled through 5 different presidents in 2 weeks. The finance minister went on national television and told the world that Argentina was suspending payments on $100 billion in debt, the largest sovereign default in history at the time. Just announced, like a weather report. Sometimes they don't announce it at all, they just stop. Russia did this in 1998. The government quietly halted payments on domestic bonds and imposed a moratorium on foreign debt repayment. No drama, no ceremony, the money just stopped arriving. Default isn't the edge of the map, it's a recurring feature of the map. But here's where it gets strange. Your intuition says a country stops paying its debts, the economy collapses, people suffer, end of story. Sometimes that's exactly right, but sometimes, and this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, the default isn't the disaster. The disaster is everything the country did to avoid defaulting. In 2001, Argentina was in its 4th year of a brutal recession. Unemployment was above 20%. The government had been slashing public spending for years, cutting wages, cutting pensions, cutting everything, all in an attempt to keep making debt payments, to stay credible, to avoid the catastrophe of default. The catastrophe came anyway, and when researchers looked back at what happened after Argentina actually did default, the economy, which had been shrinking for years, started growing again within 18 months. Not because default is good, because the austerity that preceded it had been strangling the economy slowly, and stopping debt payments freed up resources that could actually circulate. Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff at Harvard studied centuries of sovereign debt crises for their book This Time is Different. Their finding was uncomfortable. Countries that default typically return to credit markets within a few years. Lenders come back. Interest rates normalize. Life, to a remarkable degree, goes on. The patients who were told the medicine would kill them, a lot of them survived the medicine. The question was always what happened to the people who couldn't wait for the recovery. Now let's move on to something that you wouldn't expect. While governments are negotiating with creditors, life on the ground doesn't pause. The supermarkets are open. The traffic lights work. Teachers show up to school. And ordinary people who had nothing to do with the debt, who never voted for the policies that created it, who were just living their lives, are now absorbing the consequences of decisions made in rooms they were never invited into. This is what the financial headlines almost never cover, because the markets recover. The spreadsheets eventually balance, but the human cost doesn't show up in a credit rating. When Argentina defaulted in 2001, the peso, which had been pegged to the US dollar, was devalued almost overnight. Savings accounts denominated in dollars were forcibly converted to pesos at a rate that wiped out roughly 2/3 of their value. People who had done everything right, saved carefully, planned ahead, kept their money in a bank, woke up one morning significantly poorer than they had been the night before. Not because they had made a single bad decision, because their government had. Think about what that actually means for a moment. You didn't spend recklessly. You didn't gamble. You followed every piece of sensible advice anyone had ever given you about money. And then one morning the rules changed while you were sleeping. There's a concept in international law called odious debt, the idea that a population shouldn't be held responsible for debts incurred by governments acting against their own people's interests. A dictator borrows billions, enriches himself and his allies, then flees the country. Should the citizens left behind repay that money? The concept says no. The reality, almost without exception, says yes. Because debt doesn't care about fairness. Debt cares about contracts. And the contracts were signed in the name of the country, not the government that happened to be running it at the time. The uncomfortable truth at the heart of every sovereign default is this: the people who suffer most are almost never the people who borrowed the money. But the creditors aren't who you think they are either. Here's the picture you probably have. A bankrupt country, hat in hand, sitting across a table from a room full of suited bankers from New York and London, the powerful, extracting their pound of flesh from the powerless. A morality play with obvious villains. The reality is messier, and in some ways more disturbing. When Greece was in the depths of its debt crisis, which began in 2010 and didn't really end until 2018, a significant portion of its debt was held not by faceless hedge funds, but by other European governments, by taxpayers in Germany and France and the Netherlands who had absolutely no idea their money was involved. The negotiation that looked like banks versus Greece was also, quietly, German pensioners versus Greek pensioners, two groups of ordinary people on opposite sides of a ledger, neither of whom had written the terms, neither of whom had much say in how it ended. And then there are the vulture funds. These are investment firms, perfectly legal, operating entirely within the rules of the financial system, that buy up a country's defaulted debt at a fraction of its face value. They pay cents on the dollar for bonds that other creditors have written off as lost, and then they sue, in international courts, in American courts, in whatever jurisdiction gives them the best chance of collecting the full original value. Argentina spent 15 years fighting one such fund in the US courts after its 2001 default. The fund had bought the debt for around $48 million. They were eventually awarded over $2 billion. The legal fees alone cost Argentina hundreds of millions more. The people running the fund did nothing illegal. They read the contracts, identified the leverage, and applied it with extraordinary patience. Whether that makes them villains or just extremely good at their jobs depends entirely on which side of the ledger you're standing on. And here's the part that should sit uncomfortably with you. The money those funds eventually collected, it came from Argentine tax revenue, from the same population that had already watched their savings evaporate, paying again, years later, for a debt they had nothing to do with creating. Default isn't a clean break. It's the beginning of a much longer, much quieter negotiation. And the people with the best lawyers tend to do better than the people without any. So why do countries keep ending up here? That's the question underneath all of this. If default is so painful, so damaging, so difficult to escape, why does it keep happening? 200 times since 1800. The same story, different countries, different decades, different names on the debt. Part of the answer is genuinely structural. Governments borrow in good times because borrowing in good times is rational. Infrastructure gets built. Economies grow. The debt looks manageable because the projections say it will be. Then something changes. A global recession, a commodity price collapse, a pandemic, and what looked manageable suddenly isn't. The numbers that made sense in the spreadsheet stop making sense in the real world. But part of the answer is more uncomfortable than that. Governments are run by people with election cycles. Borrowing money delivers visible benefits now. Hospitals built, roads paved, services funded, voters happy. The repayment comes later, often much later, often under a completely different government, facing a completely different political reality, inheriting a problem they didn't create and can't easily solve. This is what economists call a time inconsistency problem. The incentives at the moment of borrowing point in exactly the opposite direction to the incentives at the moment of repayment. And when the moment of repayment arrives in the middle of a recession, with unemployment rising and the population already struggling, the political calculus of cutting services to pay foreign creditors becomes almost impossible to survive. So the default happens, not because anyone planned for it, because everyone, at every decision point along the way, made the choice that made the most sense to them at that moment. Rational decisions accumulating quietly into an irrational outcome. There's a study worth knowing here. In 2003, economists Reinhart Rogoff and Miguel Savastano published a paper in the Brookings Papers on economic activity examining what they called debt intolerance, the phenomenon where some countries seem to default at relatively low levels of debt, while others carry much higher debt loads without crisis. Their finding was striking. A country's history of default makes it more likely to default again, not less. Not because the economics demand it, because the institutions, the borrowing costs, and the political culture shaped by past defaults create conditions where the next one becomes more probable. Default, in other words, can become self-reinforcing. The scar tissue from the last crisis makes the next one harder to avoid, which means the 200 defaults since 1800 aren't 200 separate stories. They're the same story, running on a loop, with different people in the same roles, making the same impossible choices, arriving at the same impossible moment, the country that borrowed too much, the creditors who want to be paid, the population in the middle, waiting to find out which of them is going to absorb the loss. It's always someone. It's never the people who designed the system.